Hello, everybody. I want to start today by expressing gratitude to every single person who is a part of our church family. And of course, to those of you in the room with me, I want to say thank you, but a very special thank you today to those of you who join us week after week, and you do it virtually. Right? For those at our Racine campus who watch a big screen pretty much all the time, our Kenosha campus does that from time to time, but I know you do that pretty much weekly. I want to just say thank you to you for embracing our mission and for realizing our mission's bigger than a person standing in front of us live speaking, and you have contributed, you have served, and you have helped us bring a message of hope and healing to those of you who join us by little video screens, your computer, your phone, and you watch at home. There is a growing church that we have of people who are a part of our online church and different parts of the world. Man, it's amazing the amount of countries who've started to join us even in the last year. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And then our church knows this a little bit, but throughout the year, we are connected to different churches and have partnerships with different churches. And one of those churches that are very near and dear to my heart, and I know some of you watch regularly, is a church in the Seattle area with 6 campuses, Timberlake Church. And in this series, I know you are joining us, and I just want to say we love you and thank you. And so those in the room with me, let's welcome everybody joining us virtually today. Woo! So here's the deal. Recently, I was in a bookstore, and I came across a book that caught my eye. I had seen it before, but hadn't paid much attention to it. It's called The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. And it's a book with a few hundred pages in it, and it looks kind of like a joke because there's a lot of different cartoons in there, and the whole idea of surviving something seems a little far-fetched to be able to put down in a couple of sentences. But then you read it and think, yeah, there is some truth to this stuff. And so one of the chapters in here is how to survive in-flight emergencies. And of course, they deal with what to do if there is extreme turbulence on your flight and other expected type of emergencies on a plane that are pretty common. But then they deal with how do you deal with or how do you address a child throwing a temper tantrum? And I love some of their suggestions. They said the first thing is move if it's possible. And then they said, you can drink alcohol or headphones. But I love this one. They said, here's a pro tip. Do not offer parenting advice. It is rarely appreciated. Isn't that awesome? And then there's a chapter in here on how to survive a snake attack. And you gotta love this. They said, hold the head still with one hand and slowly unwrap the python with the other hand. Who's just gonna stay that calm? And just let me right here. Right, here we go. We're gonna do that. Right? None of us would. Another chapter is how to avoid being struck by lightning. And here's one of the pieces of advice. Do not stand under a tree. All right, now, some of the pieces of advice are a little bit more in-depth, and I wish I would have had this book back in 2005 because there is a chapter in here on how to escape a bear. And in 2005, I was camping at Yosemite with one of my brothers, along with some friends of ours, and I kid you not, a 5 or 6 foot black bear came into our campsite. And the reason I know it was 5 or 6 feet is it stood on its hind legs. And it started to rummage through our food. Thankfully, it wasn't attacking me, right? But I was so scared, I flipped back in my lawn chair, literally flipped back and went into full-on panic mode. I took the keys out of my pocket and tried to unlock remotely my vehicle. I could not even press the right button. I was shaking so bad. If I would have had this book, I would have known how to prevent an attack. Stand at full height in a neutral stance. Keep your eyes fixed on the bear. Speak softly using an appeasing tone. It is critical to show the bear that you are not a threat. Now, the advice changes and it escalates based on how intense the bear is. I didn't do any of that, and I still survived. The bear ran off, but wow, what a scary, scary experience. Now, survival guides are great when you're making split-second decisions and you've been informed of what to do. Right? And I think we could agree that it's unfortunate we do not have a survival guide for life. There's some people who might argue that, right? They might push back and say, well, the Bible is a survival guide of sorts, and I understand the sentiment and I appreciate the heart behind that. But the truth is, the Bible is not a survival guide. The Bible is a library, it's a collection of books that reveal God to us through the collective pages. But it's not a survival guide. The Bible doesn't tell us, here's how you can survive a toxic relationship. And here's how you can deal with debt that is crushing your life, right? Or here is how you can deal with a boss that is overbearing. And so it's not a survival guide. And since we don't have a step-by-step survival guide for life, what often happens, and I would actually say inevitably it happens, is at some point in our life, we don't just make a bad decision, we make a series of bad decisions, and they lead us to a place where we do not want to be. And if we stay there for too long, we end up feeling stuck or trapped or imprisoned. So a few weeks ago, I was reading a book by author and pastor Andy Stanley called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And in this book, Andy gives us 5 questions to consider when making a decision. And when I read this book, I wasn't intending to, but I thought, man, I need to make some of these chapters a part of this series, Escape Room. So I want to address one of those questions in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to let you know this, that if you are stuck or trapped in any area of your life, I'm talking your parenting, you're stuck in an addiction, you're stuck in a career that feels like it's moving nowhere, do not accept a defeatist mentality. Because regardless of where you're at, it is always possible to find hope, healing, and freedom. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul writes a letter to followers of Jesus, and in that letter, here's what he says. He says, wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Guys, this is great news. Because God's Spirit is everywhere, which means no matter where we're at, no matter how long we've been there, if we open our hearts to God, if we surrender to Him, if we invite Him into our circumstance and into our situation and into our relationship, we can find freedom. King David of Israel, he writes about this. And he speaks from his own experience about God. He says this, but in my distress, as I was stuck, as I felt like my life was at a dead end in this particular season, in my distress, I cried out to the Lord. Yes, I prayed to my God for help. He heard me from his sanctuary. My cry to him reached his ears. He said, here I am, and I feel trapped, and I called out to God, and he responded. And so regardless of the decisions we've made in life, regardless of how complicated or messed up our life may be today as a result of someone else's decisions or our own decisions, God is always ready to extend his mercy, grace, love, and forgiveness. That being said, we cannot ignore the reality that it is the decisions we make that determine our story, which means that every season of our life is a chapter in the story of our life. Right now, you are writing a chapter in your life, and so am I. Just think about this for a moment. Right? If we were to talk to people about our middle school years or maybe our high school years, everything that we would tell them about those years would pretty much be summed up in just a couple of sentences, right? High school was 4 years for some of us, right? High school was 4 years. It included so many things. It included studying and teachers and grades and activities and sports and relationships and breakups and music and smoking things you shouldn't be smoking and winter break and spring break and friends and jobs and so much more. And yet when somebody asks you about your high school years, you say, it was fine. Yeah, it was a season. I've got a lot of regrets from that season. But it's boiled down to just a couple of sentences one way or the other. The same is true with college or with marriage or with parenting. Same is true in pretty much every season of our life. Doesn't matter what it is, we condense it down to just a couple of sentences. So as we think about the decisions that we make in life, I want us to consider that no matter how big or how small those decisions may seem, at some point, those decisions are going to begin to add up to tell a story. And for the most part, this ought to encourage all of us, for the most part, we get to determine the story we tell based on the decisions we make. So let me just throw out a scenario, and it's not going to be a fun scenario. Let's just say 2021 is a horrible, horrible year for you. Okay, let's just say that this is the year the ripple effects of 2020 and everything that took place catch up to the industry you're a part of, and you get laid off and you lose your job. It's possible that the story of 2021 for you can be this story. I lost my job. I was crazy stressed out. I was embarrassed. And so I started to grow distant from my spouse. I started to grow distant from my kids and my friends. I started drinking too much. My marriage imploded. My kids avoided me at every cost, and on and on and on. Right? That could be the story we tell. Or we can say 2021 was a horrible year for me. I lost my job. It stressed me out. I was embarrassed. But somehow inside of me, I really did believe that God was with me in the most difficult and darkest times of that year. And I determined that I wasn't going to allow the stress or the embarrassment or the things I was going through, I wasn't going to allow it to disconnect me from my spouse and disconnect me from my kids. I was going to do my best to stay engaged. And even though I couldn't contribute financially at the same level, I decided I was going to find ways to contribute emotionally and contribute spiritually to my family. See, we get to determine the story we tell because the stories we tell are determined by the decisions and by the choices we make. So, if you don't like how the story of your life is unfolding, and if you don't like how this particular chapter of your life, wherever you're at today, is unfolding, you can change it by making different decisions. In the first century, the Apostle Paul writes a letter to followers of Jesus living in Corinth, and he talks about some bad places people have ended up. He talks about people who steal from others and people who lie, and he talks about people with all sorts of challenges in their character, people who are living selfishly, people who are taking advantage of others, people who are using their control and being abusive to others. And then Paul writes this: some of you were once like that. That used to be your story. That was the chapter of your life you were living, but you were cleansed. You were made holy. You were made right with God by calling on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. The grace and the power and the love of God has the ability to redirect the story of your life. So one of the filters that we would be wise to add to the decision-making process in our life is this: what is the story I want to tell? What is the story I want to tell? Now, if we're just raw and we're just honest and we just, speak out where we want our life to end up, for a lot of us, we don't have to be embarrassed of this, we want to have a story that at least tells at some level what we accomplished and achieved and accumulated and experienced. But unfortunately, those stories often bring us to a place we do not want to be. They don't end happily ever after all the time. Several years ago, Dave Chappelle, the comedian, he signs this $50 million contract. I've only signed a couple of those in my life. It's season 3, Comedy Central, and it's the Dave Chappelle show. Very familiar. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In episode 5, Dave tells a joke, and the room erupts in laughter. And he's kind of got this internal tension going on because Dave doesn't think the joke was that funny. And he does something that makes absolutely no sense at all. He literally walks off the set. And then Dave gets a duffel bag and he gets a phone and his passport and he calls his driver and he has him drive him to the airport. And he gets to the airport and Dave buys a ticket for South Africa. And he just takes off and he doesn't tell anybody where he's going. He gets to South Africa and he goes to a monastery of sorts and he spends a couple of weeks reflecting and thinking. And then after 6 or 7 months, he finds himself on the couch of Oprah Winfrey, right? Because that's where every celebrity goes when they want to reemerge. And Oprah looks at Dave and she asks the question, she goes, "Why did you do it?" And Chappelle starts getting emotional, and this comedian starts breaking down. And I don't know what it is about Oprah's eyes, but she can get into your soul. And so she says, "Dave, tell us what happened." And Chappelle says, "Oprah, here's the thing." And then he quotes somebody that I'm sure you've heard before. He says this, he says, "Sometimes success takes you where character cannot sustain you." Sometimes success takes you where character cannot sustain you. This is not simply the reality of a man worth millions and millions of dollars. It is the story of all humanity. If we've not determined who we want to be and the story we want to tell, success can ruin us. but so can failure. And so what I want to do with the rest of the time we have today is I want to tell you the story of someone who experienced incredible success in their life, but also experienced incredible difficulty and challenges, and how they navigated it in those seasons. Now, if you've been a part of a faith family, a church community, whether online or in person for a while, my guess is you're familiar with the story we're about to walk through. And I don't like that. I don't like walking through stories that I'm convinced most people have heard at some level, because if you're like me, you just have this tendency to check out or have this tendency to get to the end of the story and say, well, I know how this ends. And so we tend to miss some incredibly important lessons. So what I want you to do is do your best to stay engaged with me for the next little bit. The story takes place about 4,000 years ago, around 1850 BC. And the story focuses in on a guy by the name of Joseph. Now, even if you're not a religious person, my guess is you have heard of Joseph, right? Musicals have been made about Joseph. 20 years ago, DreamWorks put out an animation on Joseph. Back in the 1990s, TNT put out a miniseries on the life of Joseph, right? So he is a well-known individual, and his story takes place over the course of a couple decades. So this is not a quick story. This is important, right? This is not one of those stories where you pray on Monday and God answers your prayer by Wednesday. Don't you hate those kind of stories? It's like, God never does that for me, right? That's not how life works out. And we forget this, but often when we read stories in the Bible, we forget that we're reading a very condensed version of the story, because all of our lives, the different seasons are condensed to just a couple of sentences. And that happens in the Bible, and you turn a page and you forget, wow, we're 5 years later now, we're 10 years later. And that's true in the story of Joseph. Here we go. Chapter 1 is the spoiled brat years, okay? The spoiled brat years. This is pretty much from when Joseph was born until he was 17 years old. These are the years when Joseph is growing up. He has 11 brothers, and it's clear to everyone he is his daddy's favorite. Now, I can relate to that because I grew up in a large family, and I've always been my dad's favorite. And to this day, he'll Venmo me money, and he'll send me money just regular. Just don't tell the brothers, right? So I understand this. But his dad gave him lots of attention and bought him special gifts. And one of the gifts he bought for Joseph was a coat of many colors. So if you've ever watched the movie Starsky and Hutch from years ago, just picture the jacket or the coat that Snoop Dogg was wearing in that movie. All right, this is pretty much what Joseph was walking around with. Right? He's got this hip-hop fur coat that's walking around. All his brothers, they're walking around in hand-me-downs. But Joseph is loud and proud. Now, Joseph's brothers spend their days outdoors working really, really hard. Not Joseph. Joseph is inside in his bedroom playing video games and eating Captain Crunch. But when the family gets together for the big family meal, Mom and Dad can't stop talking about Joey. Oh, Joey made 3rd place today in the spelling bee. Oh, Joey, he cleaned his room, everybody. He's 17 years old, but he cleaned his room. We're so proud of Joey. I mean, he is, without question, the favorite. And so his brothers hated him, and they're jealous of him. And then there's this one particular season of his life where Joseph's brothers are all out of town. They're about 75 miles away in a community where they're watching over a large flock of animals that their father owned. Well, they've been gone for a while, so their dad, Jacob, interrupts Joseph playing video games. He's like, hey, put Call of Duty, put it on hold for a moment. I need you to go check in on your brothers and see how they're doing. They've been gone for too long. And Joseph complained, I don't want to go, I don't want to. So Dad says, okay, I'll buy you a new iPhone if you go. Please, just go. And okay. So he gets out of there, right? And he spends a bunch of time trying to track down his brothers, and eventually he finds them. And as he's approaching them, the brothers see him, and there's something that happens inside of them. All these emotions, all this jealousy start to well up. It's just kind of oozing out of them, and they start to talk between themselves, and they just decide, we're going to kill this guy when he comes, right? We're going to kill this kid. Well, thankfully, their brother Reuben is there with them. Reuben is the oldest. He's got a little bit of common sense, and he says, guys, we don't want to kill him, right? We don't want to get his blood on us. We don't want his DNA. We don't know where cameras are. I don't want to end up on Dateline. This is not a smart thing to do. And so his brothers are saying, okay, well, what do you think we should do? He says, let's just throw him in a well that's abandoned, and then let's let him die naturally. And his brothers say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Now, in the back of Reuben's mind, he's saying, hey, I'm going to come back later. I'm going to rescue Joseph. But he doesn't tell them that. And so, sure enough, this is what they do. They throw Joseph into this abandoned well. And then Reuben takes off, but the other brothers are still there. So they sit down. I mean, this will tell you how little remorse they had. They sit down and they have a meal together. They're eating Chick-fil-A, just enjoying life, telling stories, laughing. And while they're eating, lo and behold, slave traders from Egypt happen to come by the very route where they're having this meal. And the brothers start talking very quickly, and one of them has an idea, and it catches on. They say, hey, how about instead of letting Joseph die, how about we get him out of the well and we sell him to these slave traders and we make a little bit of money on him? I don't care how dysfunctional your family is. Right? These people make the Kardashians seem like role models. They're going to have their own reality show. And so Joseph's brothers sell him, but now they have a dilemma on their hand because now they got to go back home and tell their dad, Joseph's no longer with us. So what do? Well, they're not going to tell the truth. So they come up with this elaborate lie. They take his fur coat and they dip it into goat's blood. And they come up with this crazy story about how Joseph was attacked by wild animals and he must have died. And then they tell their dad the story. And he's heartbroken. And he's inconsolable. And here's what we read. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. Think about this. This group of brothers destroyed, ruined their dad's life because of a lie that they agreed to tell. And when they saw it destroying their dad's life, they didn't change course. They just kept telling it. And they would cover up one lie with another lie. Now, what's interesting is, if you remember, their oldest brother, Reuben, tried to talk him out of this. And he wasn't around when they sold him to the slave traders. When someone in our life tells us something we do not want to hear, or they say something that nobody else seems to be saying, or they communicate something that is contrary to what most of the voices and what the loudest voices in culture are saying, we would be wise to pay attention. Now, they're not always going to be right, but very few people will ever tell us what we need to hear. Well, this leads to chapter 2. Call this the slave years. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold to these slave traders. He ends up on an auction block in Egypt, and he's purchased by a guy named Potiphar. Okay, Potiphar was the head bodyguard for Pharaoh. Okay, so picture Mike Tyson. This guy is large and in charge. He is built. And so Joseph ends up in the home of a wealthy Egyptian. It's not a bad life, but he's still a slave. So how do you respond when you're betrayed by your brothers, you're kidnapped, you're sold to some slave traders, and now you end up in a foreign country where you don't know the language and you're convinced you're never going to see your family again? What do you do with that? Well, what's fascinating is Joseph did something very few of us would ever do. He decided, I'm not going to play the role of a victim. Now, Joseph doesn't necessarily believe that God caused all of this, but he does realize, hey, God allowed it. At some point, I have to accept my fate. And so Joseph says, even though I'm a slave, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to prove myself. I'm going to be loyal to my master. And he gives it his best. And here is the result. This pleased Potiphar. So he made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. So even though he had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, the story Joseph chose to tell was not the story of a victim. He's just trying to be realistic. He said, hey, man, I could be in a dungeon somewhere. I could be chained up. I could be rowing boats down the Nile River for people. I'm just going to make the best of my situation. Well, this goes on for a couple of years. And then Joseph is confronted with a very difficult scenario. Here's what we read. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. Okay, Joseph is 18 or 19 years old at the time. He's been in Egypt for a handful of years, and now he's in this predicament. And it's not just a right or wrong predicament, not just a moral or immoral. This is a life or death issue. Because when you're a slave, you can't really look at the wife of your master and tell her no, regardless of what the request is. And yet, here's what we read. But Joseph refused. Now, if we just put this in proper context, and I don't want to be disrespectful, I remember hearing this story as a teenager, and when I would hear, or even probably younger than that, more elementary kid, when I would hear, but Joseph refused, I would always think, but we don't know what she looked like. Maybe it was easy for him to refuse. We don't know, But the fact is, he's 18, he's 19. The kid is in his prime. He's probably, regardless of what she looks like, he's probably thinking, man, I need to find a reason to do this. But he's already determined the story he wants to tell. And so he vocalizes his story. And he speaks out loud to Potiphar's wife. And in essence, he says, hey, Mrs. Potiphar, I was betrayed by my brothers. I was sold to these slave traders. Your husband purchased me. And to be honest, I have a pretty good situation going on. I could be like so many slaves, but I'm in this beautiful house, and I've done my best to serve my master. I've done my best to serve the family. I've done my best just to be loyal and to do everything that is being asked of me. And at some point, Potiphar has trusted me with so much. He goes on and he says this, no one here in the house has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Translation, I don't want to add this chapter to the story of my life. Joseph knows that to sleep with Potiphar's wife would be inconsistent with the story he wanted to tell. But she pressured him. And day after day, she just kept approaching him. Joseph's story could easily have been, hey, your husband gave me an opportunity that I never dreamed of. He's been kind to me. He's given me lots of responsibility. And so I took advantage of his trust, and I had an affair with his wife, and I dishonored him, and I dishonored God. But that's not the story he chose to tell. Well, eventually, Potiphar's wife feels humiliated because she keeps being rejected by Joseph. And so she comes up with this story that Joseph tried to rape her. And Potiphar feels like he has no choice but to do something about it. He feels like his hands are tied. Now, the fact that Potiphar doesn't have Joseph killed tells us he probably didn't fully believe his wife. But he still feels like my pride is being called into question. I got to do something. So he throws him into the prison where political prisoners would be kept. Chapter 3, the prison years. Started right around the age of 20. Joseph's in prison. Things are not going good. We do know that in this time of his life, he worked hard. He tried to prove himself. He was kind to everybody around him. He earned favor with the prison guard. And as difficult as this season was, here's what we read about it. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison. To which I want to say, no, he wasn't. Because if the Lord is with you, you're not in prison. Falsely. Right? If the Lord is with you, things are going good for you. If the Lord is with you, you sell your house for more than it's worth. If the Lord is with you, your car starts every time. If the Lord is with you, your health is always perfect, right? If the Lord is with you, we associate God being with us with God doing good, with things going good in our life. But we read that God was with Joseph, and Joseph actually believed it. And it kept him focused on the story he wanted to tell. Focus is a big deal. And our responsibility is to focus on what we can control and acknowledge what we cannot. We can't control everything that happens to us in this life. We have to acknowledge that. We need to focus on what we can. And so Joseph focuses on the decisions that he makes. He knows that the decisions he makes determines his story. There he is in prison for 10 long years. And then through a series of events that we don't have time to get into, Joseph is released on a day pass. And he's called to stand before Pharaoh, who's the most powerful man in Egypt. And Pharaoh's had some disturbing dreams that he needs somebody to interpret, which is why Joseph's there. Somebody suggested, I think Joseph might be able to do this. 4,000 years ago, it was believed if you had a disturbing dream, this crazy dream, that maybe God or the gods were speaking to you through it. So here he is, and he says, Joseph, I had these dreams. He explains it. And Joseph says, all right, here's the interpretation. God gave him great insight. He says, here's what's going to happen. Egypt is going to go through our version of the .com era, and then it's going to be followed up with our version of the Great Depression. So it's almost 4,000 years ago, and the Egyptian economy is driven by grain. And Joseph says there's gonna be 7 years where there's an abundance of grain, but then it's gonna be followed by famine. Now, Joseph should have stopped right there, but he kept talking. And he gives Pharaoh unsolicited advice, which is not a smart move. But he gives this unsolicited advice on how things should be handled, and we read this. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. They listen to Joseph and they say something special about this individual. Despite everything Joseph has been through to this point, he's not marked by anger. He's not marked by indifference. He's not marked by callousness. He's not marked by regret. His life is marked by something much greater. And so this leads him to the next chapter of his life, which is the prime minister years. He's 30 years old. And Joseph earns favor with government officials and with Pharaoh, and they make him prime minister of the nation of Egypt. And God uses him in Egypt. For 7 years, they store up food because there's an abundance of it. And then when there's famine, they have enough. And the reason we even have a story to tell is because in the good seasons and the bad seasons, in the fun and not so fun seasons, Joseph kept making decisions that were consistent with the story he wanted to tell. Don't miss this. From the time he was sold to the slave traders until he becomes prime minister in Egypt is 13 long and difficult years. And he has been writing his story one decision at a time. And his decisions ultimately paved the way for him to receive this position as the second most powerful person in the nation next to Pharaoh. In the first 7 years as prime minister, sure enough, there is an abundance of grain, but then the famine takes place. And during the famine, something happens that nobody saw coming. Joseph's brothers, who lived in a different country, they're going through the same famine that Egypt is going through, but they heard that there's food in Egypt, that they put aside food. And so they show up in Egypt looking for food. And through a series of miraculous events, Joseph's brothers find themselves standing in front of him. Now, they don't recognize him. It's been a long time, but he recognizes them. It's been 20 years. And initially, when he recognizes them, he doesn't say anything. But fast forward through several different interactions, and we read this. Joseph could stand it no longer. He broke down and wept. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. The biographer could have added, "and they wetteth themselves." Right? His brothers are terrified. I mean, this is a moment where Joseph could get incredible revenge, but Joseph had decided years earlier to live a story worth telling. And at this point, he's been deciding a pretty good story for the last 20 years. He's not going to ruin it with a revenge chapter. This is where, quite honestly, I'm a little different than Joseph. Right? If you've ever seen that classic movie, Princess Bride, I would have been, "My name is Inigo Montoya. You kill my father. Prepare to die." Right? That would have been like my whole attitude in this moment. I just want to take people out. But Joseph determined to tell a different story. And so it led to the very next chapter of his life, the restoration years. This starts out right around 37 years old. He shows mercy and kindness and forgiveness to his brothers. And eventually, his entire family ends up moving to Egypt. And so even though this story is filled with pain and challenges and difficulty and betrayal, it is a story that for the most part, Joseph can be proud of, which is why it's a story that's been handed down from generation to generation to generation. And it's the reason why when we talk about Joseph, we don't talk about him as a spoiled brat. We talk about him as a role model of sorts. Every decision we make becomes part of our permanent story. So what story do you want to tell? And what story do you want told about you? Regardless of what story your story looks like right now, it can change based on the decisions you make. So let me close with this. It's one of my favorite stories to tell, and I tell it a few times a year. It's about my family, about my dad specifically. My dad grew up in an alcoholic, abusive home. His dad was a relatively good guy, except for when he would drink. He spent time in foster care. He experienced things that rightfully fueled some unhealthy things inside of him. And when my dad was in his early 20s, he got married. Now, as you can imagine, he comes into the marriage with lots of baggage. Right? There's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of things he had been through. And then early on in the marriage, my parents decided to start having kids. And it was at that time that my dad decided, I want to have a different family than the one I grew up in. His mom was like a saint, but again, when his dad would drink, things would get out of control. And so he just said, I want to have a different family. I want a close family, a loving family. He decided, I want to change the course of my family tree, but he didn't know how to do that. He had lots of questions, and my mom, who is a follower of Jesus, started to suggest, well, maybe you need to explore God, get religion, something like that. And so my dad, in his early to mid-20s, he shows up to an environment, a church, something totally outside of his comfort zone, and he starts to hear talks, and he starts to hear music and songs and about the greatness of God, and he starts asking questions, and he talks about how he would read the Bible. There's so much of it he didn't understand, and so much of it didn't make sense, and he couldn't connect the dots on anything, but eventually, he connected enough dots to know, I want to follow Jesus. So let me show you a picture of my dad from that time period. The fact that he is wearing a suit tells you he probably just returned from church or a meeting with the mafia, one or the other, right? But his decision, along with the decision my mom had made to follow Jesus years earlier, had ripple effects in my life and in the life of my siblings. And I grew up in a home that talked about the love and the grace of God. And my dad followed Jesus, so did my mom, in a sincere way that impacted my life. And if you were to get the siblings together, we got a large family, if you were to get all of us together and we were to talk about our growing up years and we were to bullet point it, we would say they weren't always easy, they weren't always fun. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't take a bunch of vacations. But we had parents who loved God. We had parents who were people of character. We respected them. And every one of us would say we were incredibly blessed to grow up in that family. You can change your family tree. You can change your current circumstances. You can change the direction you're going. It starts with the decisions you make. And if you make the right decisions, someday someone may look back at your life and talk about a chapter. They may call it the anger chapter. They may call it the chapter of addiction. They may call it the chapter of indifference, where you were just checked out. They may call it a certain thing. But the chapter will end with these words: he once was like that. She once was like that. But they encountered the grace of God. If you've never opened your heart to God's grace, you've never decided to become a follower of Jesus, maybe today's your day. And you just open your heart and say, I don't understand it all. I haven't connected all the dots, but I understand enough to know this is what I want for my life. I'd encourage you, as we pray our final prayer, that you just, in the quietness and the stillness of your heart, say, I choose to follow you. Our Heavenly Father, I thank you that regardless of where we're at in life, you provide freedom. You provide hope. You provide healing. And I thank you that regardless of what our current chapter looks like, we can be made new. And I ask in every one of our individual circumstances and situations and relationships that you would do that, and that you would give us the courage to make the decisions we need to make to move in a different direction. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.